Okay. All right. Are we ready to go?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. This is sort of the part two of our event this afternoon, and you need not have been to part one in order to be here for part two. So we're glad whether you were there earlier this afternoon or not. We're just glad that you're here. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Jay Johnson. I'm the rector here at All Saints Episcopal Church in Saugatuck. We're also live streaming. I guess there's a camera there. Is that right? Hi, everybody who might be joining us on our live streaming platforms. Thank you for doing so. We're very grateful to you as well. This is one of our events in the Crossroads of Healing series. I'll just say something very briefly about that. It is a series of occasional events in which we are inviting very explicitly, deliberately, ways of bringing together the visual arts and spirituality for building communities of social justice, and also for the sake of deep healing, whatever that might mean. And so, as we gather here this afternoon, I do want to begin by noting that we have gathered on the unceded land of the Potawatomi and Ottawa, I believe. Jason, is that correct? Portions of this land along the lakeshore are also ancestral burial grounds of these peoples long before European settlers arrived here, and to whom those indigenous peoples did not willfully yield this land. One of our guests here today, Jason Wisa, belongs to one of those indigenous tribes as a member of the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi. And I mention this for a number of reasons. One, ever since the Anishinaabe, Jason, is it Anishinaabe? Am I saying that correctly? Correct. The Anishinaabe exhibit opened at the Saugatuck Douglas History Center, where we were this afternoon. I have been even more committed to doing my homework and learning about the history of the peoples who were here before European settlers. It's a very rich history, it's a very painful history, it's a history that demands some kind of work toward justice and also toward healing, work that I don't know what that will entail. And so a modest beginning is just to name where we are on land that is unceded by those peoples. This afternoon, what we are doing here right now is trying to weave together some pieces, very powerful pieces of our life here as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. We stumbling out of it in a way, and at the same time as the 40th anniversary of the emergence of HIV and AIDS, which we marked this past June. And at the Saugatuck Douglas History Center, there are these two exhibits of the Anishinaabe arts and also the LGBTQ exhibit. How can we weave all of those pieces, powerful pieces, together? That's what we're attempting to do with this event this afternoon, with some really wonderful guests I'll introduce them more fulsomely in just a little bit, but Jim Metelsky, Justin Salviatanis, and Jason Weesaw. As part of this event, we have two big blocks of the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt hanging in the sanctuary here at All Saints. They will be on display through November 7th. We're working right now and trying to figure out a couple of days a week when the sanctuary will be open for people to come for quiet reflection and prayer in there. That hasn't been finalized yet, but we're working on that. And in just a few minutes, you'll be invited to go and see these quilt blocks, and we will welcome them into the sanctuary together with a bit of prayer. We'll be quiet mostly, but then we'll welcome them with some prayer, and then we'll come back here and engage Jason, Justin, and Jim, and Jay. We have to have the name that begins with J, apparently, to do any of this work. So, Jay, Jason, Jim, and Justin. Sounds like a boys band from the 90s, but it's not. And then we'll engage in some conversation about all of these different threads that we might weave together of memory and hope. To begin, I'd like to invite us to watch a brief interview with Cleve Jones, a little 5-minute interview. He is the originator of the Names Project quilt.
I talked about this idea for a whole year and everybody told me it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of. But I ignored them and kept going and found people who shared the vision, and it ended up becoming, I believe, the world's largest community arts project ever.
A quilt commemorating 40,000 people who died from AIDS has gone on display in Washington.
Quilts traditionally were made from cast-offs, taking scraps of fabric that are of different colors and different textures and sewing them into something that is warm and comforting. I thought it would be good therapy for people who were deep in grief. I thought of it also as a tool to help the media understand that behind all of those horrendous statistics were actual human beings that were part of families and communities and neighborhoods. But I was never really prepared for the sheer beauty of it. In the early 1970s, I was one of many thousands of young gay and lesbian kids who got here any way we could. Of course, at that time, it was still a felony to be gay in this country. It was still a felony in California. So we lived under a great deal of repression and fear.
I think, this idea that gays are going to take over the city government, I think it's amusing when I hear that.
There were a few blocks within the city where we could be completely free and be ourselves, and that meant you could hold hands with your partner, you could kiss. To come here and to find this vibrant, welcoming community was incredibly exciting.
In 1981, American doctors were baffled by a bizarre disease. Within 6 years, AIDS has spread to 71 countries and infected up to 10 million people.
We're filming this interview in a restaurant called Catch at the corner of Castro and Market Street. I was living just a couple of blocks here when I read those first stories about this new disease. That was the summer of 1982. By the fall of 1985, almost everyone I knew was dead or dying. We very quickly came to understand the signs. People who just a few weeks or months before had been athletic and healthy were suddenly getting these purple lesions. People began to get skinny. We saw people die all around us. On one block in my neighborhood, everybody died. in the span of 2 years. Ultimately, over 20,000 gay men would die in this neighborhood. I actually acquired the virus in the winter of 1978, 1979. I did not begin to show signs of that infection until 1992. I got very, very sick very, very quickly and came close to dying in 1994 before I got access to one of the very first clinical trials. I admit there are days when I still feel just overwhelmed by grief. I miss my friends. I miss them a lot. I barely passed high school biology, but I understood clearly that there was no such thing as a gay virus, and that what we were experiencing here was going to be experienced by all sorts of different kinds of people all around the planet. I remember one day exclaiming in rage to my friend, you know, if this was a meadow with 1,000 corpses rotting in the sun, then people would look at this, they would see it. So each panel is 3 feet by 6 feet, the approximate size of a grave. And that was deliberate. I wanted to show how much land would be covered if all of these bodies were lined up head to toe. By October 11th of 1987, we had collected 1,920 individual panels, and they were placed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and ended up on the front page of just about every newspaper in the world. Once people could see what I was talking about, then they kind of got the power of it. This quilt is a pretty extraordinary testament to what we went through, and it's a place that's known for its monuments. They're made out of stone and steel, and we took a monument there that was made of cloth and thread and sewn by ordinary Americans and people from all over this planet who loved someone who died of AIDS and wanted them to be remembered. It was that simple and that amazing.
So, what we would like to invite you to do is view some of the blocks of that quilt that are hanging in the sanctuary. We're asking you to be masked, please, when you go inside. And we're also, I'd like to ask you to remain quiet inside and just take in those quilt blocks and the presence of the people that they represent. After a little bit of sort of viewing together, I'll invite us to pray together to the extent that you feel comfortable in doing so. You can participate in a very, very simple, but I think powerful way of welcoming these quilt blocks into this sanctuary. So I invite you to go down this sidewalk to the main entrance of the sanctuary on Hoffman Street and up the stairs into the sanctuary.
Did anybody need a mask?
Everyone's all right? In terms of flow, Jim, do you think when we come back, shall I introduce you three trying to figure out when do we show the little 3 minutes after.
I would show it almost at the beginning.
Just right even before introduces.
Provide a little more history, then introduce us, and then
Okay.
you pick an order.
Okay.
I'm sure that this. I want to talk about being the pastor of the church
Yeah.
in that town. They just saw the picture. The 5 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would just see how each one responds. I just think that's the unique piece that we have written.
For sure. And when Cleve, talks about everyone on the block is dead. I mean,
I know.
Right. Right. Come on. No, not for prayer, but we will come back for conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had been in.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Or something. Yeah. So because I also thought maybe I don't know what prayer service is but maybe it's safe to say the names of people.
You found, I have,
I'll invite them.
I have.
You all set?
Yes.
Before we pray.
Any more?
Yeah, oh, I'm gonna get at the tongs, and
Tongs,
forks.
yeah.
Yeah.
You can carry that? I think for history, is that Father Jay's file system? We don't have a picture of that.
That is hilarious. I don't
I
know.
guess it's, yeah.
I don't think it
That's
is.
character.
I've never seen that. I think it might be Jim Matowski. Yes.
Oh,
She's bringing out.
Linda's bringing tongs.
faithful in our advocacy for those on the margins of caring communities. Grant, O God, that in this and all our troubles, we may put our whole trust and confidence in your steadfast love. We ask all this in the name of the beloved Jesus. Amen. Solomon beautified the sanctuary and multiplied the vessels of the temple. Oh, the majesty and magnificence of God's presence.
Moreover, in the splendor of God's mighty place.
Let us pray. O God, you sanctify the use of material things for your glory. Graciously assist us to honor these panels of the Gays Memorial Quilt, which we welcome now into this sanctuary of your presence.
I think we should, yes.
Draw those in whose loving memory these panels were made ever deeper into your own life. And may they inspire us as we pray here to bear bold witness to the gospel of the world. Pray this in the name of Jesus, and whom you have become one of us. Thank you. And you can take your time, there's no rush, but when you feel ready to make your way back out under the fence, please do so.
Gotcha. Fingers are just as good as the blade. Darn good. Who needs dinner? Very good. We'll figure this out.
I'm very happy where I am.
Please come have something to eat. We have plenty of food and plenty of wine. Oh, yeah, right. But you can
So there is a national organization called AIDS Memorial, and the main project is part of that. There's a Memorial Grove in San Francisco. The main place, I think, where most of the quilt blocks are housed, I think, is in Georgia. Is that right? Near Atlanta?
Yeah,
Is that
there's a
right?
big warehouse.
Really big. Right. It's so big now that there isn't a single location where the whole thing can be displayed at once. And you simply contact them, and you pay for shipping, and there are certain parameters under which where they can be displayed, and then there's a donation that you make to the organization, and they arrive. And yeah.
Thanks. How are you?
No,
So there's a certain, you sort of request a period of time that you want to keep them displayed. So we made the arrangements to do this through November 7th, which happens to be All Saints Day, which is why we're doing
November 7th?
Well, yes, it's November 1st, you're correct. However, the Sunday on which we celebrate it is the next one. Yes, absolutely, you are correct.
Bill Brown has all of his games.
You're Jim's friend from wonderful. We've been friends for 30 years or so. Oh, cool.
Looking at it, it's like, oh my gosh. And then I started painting, and it was him making such the very first time I was here.
Yeah, well, actually, Jim and I worked together at the church in San Francisco, I was directing a program in Los Angeles. That program, so we've worked together for many years. They were transgender. Originally, it's been an experience actually. Doing like so it's kind of fun because I've never been to so I've been to Detroit, but I've never been to this one. Totally different. Yeah. Like driving past windmills and stuff. Like, oh, right.
It's the shores, there's this, there's, but,
Your dad was probably
How cool. Yeah, so I'll have to go back and visit and explore more. Wow, yes.
Anyway, when they retired,
Yeah, but I went up there and she would, you know, I'll be
yes, I was not making fun of that. I think it's, I mean, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right. I did see very involved. I can't even. Well, we offered. Yes. When you change. Yes. You got it, buddy. And that, the mixing of the races, as the critics called it, was the reason that it was antique. Not because it was so many tons of healing.
the mixing of the races.
Mixing of the races.
I wonder if we could start moving back to our chairs, getting some wine and delicious food. Many, many thanks to Margie and David Mason and others, and Linda and Bert McCroy for feeding us.
Second.
I've been in California so long, I know we have.
I like this plastic. They put film in that shit.
But I'm not.
Oh, yes.
Should I take them off?
No.
I was teasing you. Jason, is your uncle maybe we could I think the former head of the former head of
Oh, I didn't know that.
okay. And he make interesting maybe some kind of some of the stuff. But he's dealt with every obviously when you have that job, you're dealing with a lot of
Too many beautiful things.
But when I worked with your uncle, one of the things other than the tribal names that were people thought offensive, which of course here was one of them. One of the other issues was discrimination against deaf children. There was a big fight going on over different kinds of systems, sign language, whatever. And he handled it beautifully. Thank you so much for your reverential presence in the sanctuary as we welcomed those quilt blocks into that space. Very much appreciated. It's very moving, I found it to be. And we can have some time to process that together for sure. I want to introduce our three guests, those of you who did not hear me introduce them over at the History Center earlier today. And then after I introduce them, I'll invite us to watch another short, very short, just 3-minute video clip. Something very different, but from the same time period and an important slice of this history for us to consider. First of all, I've already mentioned Jason Weesaw, who is a mixed material media artist, member of the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi people, and his work is featured over at the History Center right now, and is just really beautiful, beautiful work. I highly encourage you to see it. Next to him is Jim Mitulski, who is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. He is currently the interim pastor of Island United Church of Christ in Foster City, California. Back at the height of the AIDS years, as we sometimes refer to it, in the 80s and 90s, Jim was the senior pastor of the MCC congregation in the Castro district in San Francisco. He'll tell you perhaps a little bit about that experience of ministering to that congregation during the height of those years of HIV and AIDS. And next to him is Justin Saviatanis, who is assistant professor and director of the Center for Social Transformation Program at United Theological Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. And Justin earned his PhD at the Graduate Theological Union in Interdisciplinary Studies with an emphasis on art and religion and social change. Wonderful set of speakers, a very rich conversation ahead of us. Before we get into that conversation, as I just mentioned, this is a short clip of another contextual piece of that era that Cleve Jones was talking about. Cleve Jones, you probably heard in his voice some frustration about what was happening during those early numbers of years in the pandemic. And here you'll see some of that frustration being taken to the streets with ACT UP protesters, and Jim can tell you more about that. I tempted to tell you what you're about to see, but I think I'll just let you see it. It's about 3 minutes long.
Come on,
Hey, Steve.
Uh-oh.
Thank you for coming. Why is this not showing up?
I don't know.
Oh, let me see. Wait a minute.
Did the TV turn off?
It might have.
Looks like it did.
Oh, the power. The
Yeah.
power has to be on?
And then
Input, right?
yeah, but don't update. Okay. Yep.
Oh, great.
Oh no, it's set preparing the software to
Oh, no,
update.
don't do that.
So yeah, you want to go to HDMI 1. There you go.
Yay.
Okay.
Bless you, Steve.
Just my presence.
Intimidates good behavior.
They're guilty of genocide and murder. They, along with former President Reagan, allow the AIDS pandemic to go virtually without any action and are responsible for the death of possibly millions of people.
Today because we're tired of this administration and we're going to take the ashes of some of our friends and drop them on the steps of the White House because we're not going to take it any longer. Every day somebody is dying.
On this side.
Let me tell you a story.
Yes!
Yeah! Good! How about you? This is our home.
Sorry.
What it really
Yeah. We needed a little break.
Yeah, that's good.
So, when I did some prep with these three gentlemen, Jason very wisely said we probably really don't need to do a lot of formal structure with this conversation. We can let it flow. So I'm not going to be doing a lot of facilitation, just to sort of let this flow back and forth, trying to weave together some connections here around any number of things. We started having some conversation at the History Center about ways of thinking about LGBTQ communities and indigenous communities, native tribes. There are some powerful ones we could talk about between healing blankets and the Names Project quilt, any number of things. But I wonder if I could ask Jim, do you feel up to starting and saying some things about what we just saw, perhaps, or anything you'd like to invite us into?
Sure. In the course of what I hope to do this afternoon, in the course of the sharing and the interaction, is I'll tell you a little bit about what we just saw. Later, I want to share 2 or 3 stories of actual people who were just random people that I had the occasion to, as a pastor, who were people with AIDS, or their parents, or their family members, to make their stories dimensional, names from the quilts, if you will. So I was the pastor from 1985 to the year 2000 of the Metropolitan Community Church at 150 Eureka Street in the Castro district of San Francisco, the very same neighborhood where Cleve Jones was interviewed and where the Natives quilt originated. It was the Protestant church in the Castro. And what does that mean? It's where you went if you weren't Catholic. Not a sophisticated definition of Protestant, but really it's where anyone went who grew up, if they were gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, in a religion that did not accept them, and then moved to San Francisco to find the life that they couldn't have where they were from, and still wanted to have a spiritual life. So they ended up at the MCC, as it was called, Metropolitan Community Church. Sometimes we called it Midwestern Community Church because we had every tenor from every church choir from anywhere from Iowa to Michigan. But really, it was a mixed place, and what it had in common was people who wanted to be liberated from religion, and who had been told because they were gay, they were being punished with AIDS. So the first thing I want to say is this, that God does not punish through illness. And it may sound obvious, but I just wanted to say it. God does not punish through illness. God suffers with people who are ill. And God works with scientists to overcome illness. But God does not punish through illness. If we have a notion that God punishes people whom God has created in God's image in any way through illness, that is not God. That's a monster, but not God.
Amen.
And then I want to say this. We saw a beautiful piece of art that came out of the pain and suffering of AIDS. And remember, we didn't have a cemetery, and San Francisco itself does not have any cemeteries because of earthquakes, right? You know that if you know about San Francisco, you know that all the cemeteries after the 1906 earthquake, all the bodies were removed and moved out of town, and there's no cemetery in San Francisco. But in addition, there was no place for gay people who died often to be memorialized or remembered. So our cemetery was a spiritual place. It was those quilts. And a place to remember, a place to celebrate the lives that were actually lived. Not the myth that people sometimes, families wanted to be wanted us to remember. Those are the real stories on those quilts. And those quilts are beautiful, but they represent a lot of sadness and tears, as well as beauty and truth. And there's another dimension, and I was the one who kind of advocated for this kind of sobering showing of this clip about the AIDS action from ACT UP. And there was a lot of anger also during that period. And anger, personally, is what got me through those years. I still have a little of it. But I think that for religious people especially, and I know we're not all a religious group, but I do want to say this, anger is not a bad thing. And anger also turned to advocacy, turned to action, kept us alive.
Yeah.
And that's what you saw depicted there. Think about what would it take to get you to take the ashes of your loved ones and put them on the White House lawn as an act of protest. It's a pretty daring act. It was then, it was still, it's a measure of how angry we were. Because this was the period from 1981 when the government spent 2 years saying you can't mention the word homosexual in directives from the Center for Disease Control reports about AIDS. Because they didn't, the Reagan administration didn't want to admit that there was the existence of a homosexual community. Homosexual, I hate that word. Gay. Sorry. And then through 1989, you know, AZT, when AZT started to become more popularly employed, it was the late 80s when it was introduced, there were no treatments for AIDS, okay? Nothing that worked. So people lived for 9 months between diagnosis and death, typically. And then with AZT, it added 11 months. And there was nothing new between 1989 to 1995. So they went from 9 months to 18 months. That was the typical length between diagnosis and death. That's a very long time. And in all through the 80s, there was silence. We had presidents who wouldn't say the word AIDS. And we fought even for money for research. Because here's what the debate in Congress was about. You can see clips of this. Congressmen and women, senators and House, Democrats and Republicans saying, maybe this is God's way of ridding the population of undesirable people. And in the 80s, and then so they didn't fund it. That's a very long time. That's a long period of silence. We'll talk later about what the churches were doing, but they were complicit in the silence, largely. But there was what they called the 4-H Club. Who got AIDS in the 80s? People who had hemophilia, that's what the word was in the 80s. Heroin or IV drug users, homosexuals, Haitian immigrants, for a very complex reason that I won't go into. But in the United States, there was a cluster of people with HIV. And then sex workers, who was the 5th H, and the H was harlot, I hate to say it, I'm sorry. But this was the people who had it. So who had AIDS determined what kind of treatment, if any, they got or deserved. And it was additionally religiously stigmatized. And that's rarely happened in history like this, where the people who had it were blamed for having it, and the churches and the religious groups joined in this chorus of condemnation, and it affected access to treatment and research about the disease. That's the context that we're talking about when we talk about the 80s and 90s, really, until 1995. That's all I'll say for now, but maybe I'll have more later. Who's next?
I should also say, by way of background, that I pastored, associate pastored the church Jim was at, and also pastored other congregations that have large numbers of people with HIV and AIDS. So I'm speaking in part from that place, but I want to start from in 1987, there was a March on Washington, and I was 20, had just turned 22, and we'd come down overnight on buses from colleges in Massachusetts, and were unloaded on the National Mall pretty much at dawn. So the sun's just coming up, and there's that morning mist, and out of the mist we could hear sort of this snapping sound. And it was the sound of the panels unfurling in the wind, because when the wind catches cloth. So we followed that sound, and people were just beginning to lay out that image that you've seen of all those panels on the National Mall. And I distinctly remember one person who had one man was carrying a huge bag of what turned out to be tissue boxes, and another person was with him and putting a tissue box on the corner of each of those corners, anticipating the grief that was going to be in that space. And that's one of the memories that just really struck with me. But what I want to say about it, in light of both the art exhibit, the panel itself, my experience on the National Mall that day, is that the Names Project quilt allowed people to lay a sacred space, to sacralize, to make holy ground in a space that was not sacred and was not for our kind, and to claim that space, right? So filling the entire National Mall to say, you cannot ignore these precious lives that we've lost because they're in this space. Washington, D.C. is supposed to be about the people, by the people, for the people, and we know there's many people who have never been represented well in that space. And coming into that space and saying, we're claiming this, and we're not just saying it because we're here and we're marching and protesting. All of those things are important, and all those things happened. Although I think the greatest impact they had was on us, taking back those streets, not on the people we were marching against, many of whom, as Jim said, had already hardened their hearts against that message. But rather, this precious moment of creating a sacred burial ground in which we could honor the people who had no place. And when we were in the sanctuary earlier today, and I looked at those panels, it reminded me of being in places in Europe, places established, cathedrals built long before the ones here, in which people were buried in crypts in the ground, in burial places in the wall and on the ground. Not in a way that's seen as creepy, but as a way of saying that our ancestors are cluster around us, that some of them have become saints, and that they are part of our story. And so it's a way of naming our sacred place. And I want to suggest that mapping out sacred place, or claiming for ourselves the holiness of our lost loved ones, serves a couple functions. One, it's a way of memory as both resilience and resistance, right? We are resisting your attempts to erase us. See, look, we're here. And that we are showing the living people remain to sew those panels. Some of whom went on to have their own panels, but there's like literal threads of continuity with people. And I think we also should view these panels in a way that reminds us that this is not just a story about the past. First of all, the AIDS crisis is not over globally and even in our country. That there are many people who still do not have access to treatment, do not have access to preventive, what they need to prevent themselves from getting the disease, which is very complicated. But also that this is a community that's saying we do not forget our ancestors, we do not forget our dead, and we have a future, we have a present, we are here right now, and we have a future. You will not bury us all. We are still here. And I know that that same mode of resistance and resilience, and that need to claim both past, present, and future is true for other communities in the United States, including those of our indigenous siblings and relatives here in this country, the Native or African American communities that have been erased. Right? There's a need to say that these are not historic events that just happened in the past, but that people have come from those communities and will continue to come from those communities and will continue to contribute to those communities. So when I see those panels, those are my spiritual ancestors, but they also remind me to claim the precious life in this moment and to make it possible for more of us to continue to live and to thrive, and to not allow neglect to kill people
say other than being in that space was extremely reverent. I don't think you necessarily would have had to even ask for people's silence or for their attention to be captured in a really humble way. I think even though we're examining things from the LGBTQ, HIV/AIDS communities and things from the indigenous community or a Native American perspective, I think when you center those things, you have a tendency to think of, oh, that's what was happening to those people. That's what happened to them. But carrying a baggage, a weight of pain in our lives is something that we've succumbed to as human beings. And at some point you have to ask yourself, I believe, how much weight do I want to continue to carry without being able to find ways of healing, ways of shedding that I'm carrying around? Because it has such a negative impact on your life that it makes it hard to move forward sometimes. I'm not trying to suggest that we don't look at these things or that we don't have open discussions about them, but what I am suggesting is that as human beings, I think we're all feeling alienated from places, alienated from the land, and we all are searching for happiness. We're all searching for love. We're all searching out who are those people that comprise my tribe. My tribe is more than just the Potawatomi people. My tribe are those in my life that have stuck through me and have come to my side through thick and thin. And I think everyone is out looking for their tribe, their family, their community, where they feel at home, where they feel like they can let their guard down, where they can feel like they can shed some of this weight that this culture here in our country is just so dead set against trying to convince people that they need to carry. I thank you so much, and Bobby too. I've been asked to come so many places, but when Bobby handed me the handout of what today's event was going to be like, I said, you know, they've really put some thought into not only inviting me to come to this, but why they wanted me to come to it. And I really appreciate that, because often I'm just asked to come as the Indian guy. Oh, don't forget to bring your drum. Yeah, you know, so I really appreciate the invite to be a part of this conversation and this idea of healing and love today.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah.
Now is the time.
Sure. Yes, we can make this
Now
free
is the
flowing.
time. It's a great album, but. Okay, could someone hand her a mic?
Oh, let me do that. Yeah.
You can do this. We're there. Yeah.
We got that.
We're right there with you.
I was reading about Deb Haaland today, the new Interior Secretary, who is Native American for the first time in that position, who's making Indigenous people a priority, finally. And, you know, it's something that I don't think a lot of us see, that there are emojis of her, there are all kinds of things that are happening in the Native American population. I don't know if you've seen it or not, or if I'm exaggerating from what I read. But it's really significant, I think, that the power that this is going to have. And then I think about AIDS and how it took so long to get recognition. And then I think about, I've done some study of Native American, about this much, okay, and you know, how long it's taken for recognition of some of the issues that have gone on in that community. And I sort of like see that if we don't pay attention to people that don't have power, then a lot of sadness can happen, a lot of injustice can happen, and that we need to keep our hearts open to people who are saying this is a problem. And it resonates with both the, the whole AIDS movement, and then also with Native Americans, who then we saw suffered from greater infections with the coronavirus. So, as Christians or as people that attend church in order to get a boost for things they believe are right, this is a good pairing here. It's a good pairing to see how we can stay attuned and attentive to things that maybe we don't see the connection at first. But thank you for bringing these connections to us.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And actually, can I ask you to say who you are?
Oh, no.
Betsy York.
Thank you. Just so everybody knows who we are. We're keeping track.
I think one of the really fascinating things that came out of our preliminary conversation, and has only resonated more with me since we've been in this exhibit, we saw the exhibits and so forth, is this idea of place. And I'm thinking about Saugatuck Douglas as a place that people created safe space for themselves. And there's that one quote that was in the Historical Museum about the driving here felt like driving towards freedom.
Toward freedom, yeah.
What does it mean to create space, literal place, and what does it mean to honor the sacred lands of people whose place, who were caretakers, who were inhabitants, who were part of these places, but also recognizing that for so many queer people, and I think it's changing in some ways now, but it's still true, that to find that safe place, you have to create it in a place like this, and you have to leave your family of origin in order to find any sense of safety or community, to find that sense of where are people who understand me, where are people who celebrate the way I live life. And I think that's part of what I love about the Names Project panels, is those sort of pieces of life resonate through. These are people who found their people in these places, who celebrate their life the way they are. You see the artifacts as part of those quilt panels. But I'm thinking about I think as Jason, as you said, like we're all craving this place in which we have community, in which we're known, and that's for so many queer people, it required a movement, a pilgrimage, a journey to another place in order to find that or to create it. And I think this is witness of it. And even these panels coming together from different places, merging into those one blocks, even though they're from different places, I think is further evidence of that. And that's why I want to start with this idea of sort of how do we create sacred place in which we feel safe, in which we feel bounded, and where our hearts are fed in ways that are healing.
Here, under the tent.
Oh, no. Okay. I didn't want to zip by you. Did I see somebody? Did someone say something over here? No. Oh.
Betsy said here.
Here.
Is where we find it.
Sacred place.
Here. I thought you were asking for the tent.
Got it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want you guys all to understand something about our culture. At the foundations of our culture is a respect for all things and for finding the spirit in what is special in all things. That could be another human, could be an animal, could be the way that a river flows. It could even be a stone, which most of us would look at and, oh, that stone's been sitting there for forever. But over a couple hundred years, that stone may move just a few inches. When we go into our sweat lodges and we bring those glowing hot stones in there, and we put them in the middle of the lodge, and we pour water over them, and we get that spiritual and physical healing from that ancient ceremony. Those stones had a job to do. They were created and waited hundreds and thousands of years to be able to come into that lodge and to provide the healing to those that were gathered there. So that respect and that that humble way of acknowledging the beauty that's in everything. So what I wanted to say is that one of the tenets of our culture is a respect for what we call two-spirit people. People that may be gay, homosexual, bisexual, what have you. They were never persecuted or casted out of our communities. They were acknowledged and treasured for the way that they could balance both sides in life. The night and the day, the hot and the cold, the anger and the happiness that he spoke of. And so two-spirit people are honored, always have been in our communities, and continue to be to this day.
Thank you for saying that. Because that is not the case for most other communities. I was thinking as you said that, and then also, Justin, as you were describing the necessary migration to safety, why it's important for LGBT people to be in solidarity with people who are migrating, the natural human act of migration right now to the United States for safety. You know, when gay people are not in solidarity with people who are migrating here, it makes me crazy, because we all know what it means to have to migrate for safety. But one thing that happened during AIDS is this. We had been told by our religious faiths, all of them, we don't want you here because you are gay. And AIDS is not a gay disease. We'll talk about that later. But that's how it manifested here in many communities. But then, so here we are, gay people left. We never left religion, it left us. And then we were dealing with mortality, with disease, with illness. And the churches really didn't want us even more. And I think back on that, I think it's part of it's an unhealed part of my own journey. At first they said they didn't want us for being gay, and then we really needed help around dealing with mortality. And they weren't interested, except if we were willing to repent of our homosexuality. Then they were willing. And that's why the natural expressions, like the AIDS project, or the Names Project, these quilt panels, there's something deeply spiritual about that. But it didn't happen in church. I mean, it happened like in weird little marginal churches, like our little pink and purple church in the Castro. And we always said we were gay first, Christian second, because that was our survival. That we had to tap into something deeper than a tradition that hated us in order to survive. And there was something deeper, because God is greater than the religious traditions. But it really forced us to find something that was deeper. It was just ironic that when we really needed religion, it had already turned its back on us.
I think the other thing that forced us to do, though, is to turn to one another. And, I think about I'm incredibly honored to be a part of a community that did so much so quickly, actually, in the history of AIDS, people immediately organized to help people because when someone was found out to have AIDS, they were evicted from their apartments, they lost their jobs. Many people rallied with food and supplies. People created, almost right away, buddy programs so that no one had to be alone if they didn't want to be. That people had visitors, and tremendous efforts. And lesbian women in particular, and straight women came forward in a way to help the men's community in ways that had never been bridged that way before. And just to think, what does it mean for community to really care for one another in that profound way, some of which was learned in church, I will say, churches that were unwilling to share that with us, but to think about the tremendous effort that people spent all their time when they weren't working, caring for other people in these ways, going to protest meetings, doing all of these things, was a tremendous surge of the human spirit. And I think, living in Minneapolis, at the time George Floyd was murdered and there was unrest in the streets, one of the first things that sprung up were mutual aid societies. So the people whose grocery store was just burnt down could go and get groceries. And it really reminded me of, as much as there's these forces of human, people being excluded, of hatred, of, all of these forces in humanity, there's also this tremendous upwelling of the willingness to help other people in need that happens at the same time. And, so I think those kinds of the ways in which those mutual aid popped up should be deeply these are the stories. The people who stitched those quilts were the people who cared for those people while they were dying often, and they're the people who cared for who after one person died, just shared the resources that person left with other people in the community so that more people could purchase medications or have food good nutrition that they needed, or all of those kinds of things. And I think I don't want to paint a panacea on it. On the other hand, that was also tremendously, I would say, faithful to the human spirit, faithful to the love that people had for one another, that responded to that crisis with no government help, with no help from most church organizations or any other kind of social service networks that we had. People created one, and they continue to create that in communities of resistance today to say, okay, if you won't help us, this movement continues, so we're going to help one another. So I just want to name and honor the people who provided tremendous amounts of care, self-sacrificially, in order to help others live or to die with dignity.
One thing that reminds me of, we actually changed how healthcare is delivered. Because prior to AIDS, individual patients interacted with the healthcare system, but did not interact with each other. During AIDS, people applied what we had learned in gay and lesbian rights organizing to pressuring the government for more accountability and access to resources. We unionized as patients, essentially. So that's how you had things like ACT UP. As cancer patients, previously, cancer patients don't interact with each other. You get what the doctor says you'll get, right? AIDS patients collectivized and pressured the NIH, the CDC, the Food and Drug Administration, to change how quickly drugs were tested, how they were delivered, who had access to them. It didn't end up succeeding in universal health care, which is painful to me after all that, because look what happened during COVID. We yet again had another epidemic where who was affected by it affected what kind of access to care they got. And it's the same thing. We've actually seen this before. Disproportionate numbers of people of color, of people living in poverty, do not have the same access to health care around COVID that people who have insurance, for example, do have. It's not a perfect equation, but there's something there. But collectivizing and unionizing around healthcare issues is a positive contribution, I think, of the AIDS years.
And the reason we got a vaccine so quickly.
And it is why we got a vaccine as quickly as we did, yeah.
Because the protocols were changed about how quickly compassionate use and how things could come along, so there's a direct correlation, I think, there.
Let's see.
Show my age, this is like being Phil Gunn.
Let's see.
You know my name now.
Of course I do.
I'm an advocate of the United Church of Christ, so that's first off. And Jim, I don't want to deny the experience that you had, but in my whole life growing up in the United Church of Christ, it has been maligned with right-wing churches for so long. I just have to say, from my experience, I don't think the United Church of Christ turned its back on people with AIDS, because I was in the church then, and we were very supportive of people with AIDS. It is a dying, at least my experience. That's why I'm saying yours is one, mine's another. But as a denomination, and maybe even the progressive Episcopalians, get swept up into this broad, the churches, left us here, and the churches did this, and the churches called us this and that. Not all churches. There is a way, and there are pathways expressed in progressive churches to find a way that is far better, far following the teachings than many others. And I just want to speak up for that at this point.
Jay, support the Episcopal Church.
I am not gonna. We've got speakers here.
I'm also a member of the United Church of Christ and was raised in the Presbyterian Church. I will tell you, as someone who studied this historically as a seminary professor, while all of those denominations, including the progressive ones, Jewish and Christian, passed resolutions, and a few churches stepped up, numerically the numbers until the 90s, the numbers of actual volunteers was very low, much lower than it's painful for me to admit. So while the UCC and the Presbyterian Church and the Episcopal Church did not have fiery people saying you're all going to hell, it's an abomination, there was not the widespread activism that I would have wanted either. So I think your point is correct, and it's also a painful truth that there was not as much as I wish that there were. When you look at which churches mobilized volunteers, or which churches had food pantries, or which churches supplied buddies for programs, there were certainly some, and some that worked heroically, and chaplains who fought tooth and nail for people's rights in the hospital when people were not even getting their food trays delivered to them. So there were absolutely people who did it, but in sheer numbers, I wish the picture were rosier historically too. So, but they did some very early initial resolutions and things like that. But I have to say, as a pastor in the UCC, some of our resolutions don't go into action as fast or as far as I would wish they would.
I will just say one thing, as Jim reminded me of this. If there might be an analogy to be made around the way that healthcare was conceived, understood, and delivered by this kind of unionization of patients. There might be an analogy between that and what happened in some churches of a kind of grassroots organizing around HIV/AIDS and the needs that presented. I'm thinking of an organization, to speak about the Episcopal Church. The National Episcopal AIDS Coalition, NEAC, was not an official Episcopal ecclesial structure. That was a grassroots organization of people around the country. So I think there's a distinction to be made that's worthwhile making between institutional structures and policies taken by national church bodies, which I do think on the whole were really bad during the 80s and early 90s. But that on the grassroots level, there's another story to tell, which I think Betsy is pointing to.
Yeah, and I'll also say you're correct to point out, Betsy, that we're actually conflating time periods, because the early 80s to the early 90s, the religious organizations did very little. After that, there was certainly a change in religious organizing in the 90s, and including that period from 91 to 95 before protease inhibitors, 96 when protease inhibitors were widely available. And so there was so we may be talking about two different time periods in which both of these statements can be true at the same time. But
I am a United Church of Christ minister, so and I'm proud to be one today. But there's a long period. This is 40 years of AIDS now, and that 10-year period, especially throughout the 80s, that's a long period of silence if you're living in it. I don't know what else to say about that. I do know that in 1989, the National Council of Churches came to San Francisco to study AIDS. 1989, okay? And they came to our church, our little church, and they said that they didn't know where else to go to study AIDS except the gay church in San Francisco. And we were glad to welcome them because, we're hospitable people, and we showed them a great time. And they said they'd never been to church like that before. It's true. They came on a bus. Delegates from all the member denominations and their observers, and they sat in our balcony to watch us have an AIDS healing service, which we did every week. We gathered, we sang gospel music, we laid hands on each other for healing, and we also had the Lord's Supper every week, which they asked us just before the service, as they gathered in the balcony, to watch the homosexuals have a healing service. This is true. You know, we were good sports. They said to me, "We'd like to ask you not to have communion tonight." Because, well, it's a National Council of Churches event. And it's not that we don't want to have communion with you, but we don't like to have it with each other. I'm like, okay, as long as I could say that before the service. So I did. I just got up and said, you know, our friends have asked us not to have the Holy Communion tonight and I want to be really clear, because, you know, there was a lot of fear around taking communion with gay people and with people with AIDS. And so they just wanted to be clear that they said that they didn't want to, this wasn't that they wanted to take it with us, they just didn't want to take it with each other. And it put them in an awkward position. Well, the congregation just burst into hysterical laughter. That's the funniest thing they ever heard. And it actually broke the tension, so I was grateful for that, because nobody likes to be watched having church, right? But, and they did have a transformative experience. You know, they're mostly from liberal Protestant churches, frankly. That's who the National Council of Churches was. Like my own United Church of Christ, right? And most of the people who were in the gay churches at that time are now in the United Church of Christ, but not until the 90s and the 2000s. It took a much longer period of time. And, you know, I think if we had waited for these churches that were commissioning studies, that's what they were doing in the 80s. We would have died on the vine without a spiritual home if we hadn't created our own grassroots, self-determined spiritual homes and believed that these were real, these were legitimate. We actually asked as gay churches to join the National Council of Churches, and they did not allow us to join. Still true. They permanently tabled our application. They said, even after visiting us twice, because they said, basically it comes down to who you are. It's not, obviously you have the sacraments, you know, you sing like nobody else. It's not about what you do or what you believe on paper. It's just that we can't have gay churches in the National Council of Churches. And I must say that the United Church of Christ was one of the churches that voted against our membership. And as did all the others. And what they said to us was, you have to understand, it's for the greater good that we're asking you not to join.
And a slight nuance to that is that it's because other churches said they would leave if we were joined as members.
Right.
And the churches said we vote to preserve the unity by keeping out the churches.
So I don't mean to diss my own denomination, the United Church. I'm grateful for it. But I think that when we tell a whole history, we have to tell the whole history, the length of it, the breadth of it, you know. And that's why I'm in it today, because it did change, you know. We probably saw that Bishop Spong had died this week.
Yeah.
Some of you saw it. He was a great Episcopalian hero in my book. Yeah. We used to have him preach every week at the gay church, every once a year at the gay church in San Francisco. But the Episcopal churches in San Francisco wouldn't let him preach. Never, not once, ever. And that's how it ended. He never was allowed to preach at an Episcopal church in San Francisco. So, but to tell that now you'll read all the obituaries. Oh, we love Bishop Spong. Everybody loves Bishop Spong. No, they didn't. And that doesn't. I'm not saying that to diss the Episcopal church, because he was a real Episcopal bishop. But if we have to. Part of what is beautiful about the story, the true story, is people changed, and they changed because they heard real stories. I think that names quilt changed people, you know, because they heard the stories of real life people, and it actually caused a change of heart. It took a while, but today I don't think there's as much stigma about people with AIDS as there was then, though there's still some.
All you gotta do is watch advertising on television these days. I mean, it's become very mainstream. You mentioned the improved methodology.
You've got to give your name.
Who are you?
You've seen me in the post office wall. Don Ollendorf. Yeah, obviously some of the things that have happened with expedited approvals of life-saving drugs. What other things have been, have emerged out of this horror that, I know that many of the people who are experts in the virus we currently have, I realize, are people who are veterans from this whole AIDS issue. Are there other things that you think, as theologians, have really been, out of tragedy, has been helpful to us in terms of a hopeful world? And by the way, I have a disease that is not even anything viral related, and I'm so grateful because with some of the treatments I have had were as a result of some of those issues.
I think that AIDS did play a significant role in humanizing who LGBTQ people were, particularly who gay men were, but more broadly the community, in that people were on the news and could be seen as human beings. And while some people rejected that with messages of denouncement and anger and hatred and all those things, I think other people did have to recognize, and that people recognize that people are were their relatives, right? That people in small towns and people in large cities and people recognize that they did actually know someone, and that it forced the community to come out in ways that weren't necessarily true before, in ways that couldn't be hidden any longer. And I think that and I think the culture, the gay and lesbian liberation movements and other liberation movements related to sexual orientation and gender identity were moving to a place where that visibility was coming out, and this sort of forced. So I don't think it's not AIDS was the thing that did it, but it was part of that other trajectory. I also think, speaking as a theologian, so Evan Wolfson, who was the architect of the same-sex marriage movement, really. I mean, there were other strains before him, and so forth, but he came up with the idea of using marriage as the center point to push forward gay rights, as opposed to employment discrimination, which is much more popular and has always been much more popular with Americans, even though we can't get a bill passed, and other things. Why? Because he read John Boswell's book. This is true. Have you heard? Have you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he read John Boswell's book on the history of same-sex marriage and said, "Hang on a second. Like, if this is part of church history, and this is a part of a value that has been part of the church, and why are straight people fighting same-sex marriage? Because they're saying this is about the dignity of the ability to love your partner. So we want that same thing. So what if we use these theological ideas basically in a popular mode to tell people that the values you have and the values I have, these are the same values, and that's the way to lead on all the other rights, and that we will get acceptance if people recognize that the longings of our heart are for love and family, and they're the same. Now I know there's other things we lost by that decision, including some ways in which queer people create community through love, through sex, through other ways that are broader than the society has generally understood. Right? Ways to create intimacy and community and pleasure and joy as part of both a spiritual experience, a sexual experience, those things, by conflating it into just a narrow category of two people getting married. There's a loss there as well. But I would say that there's this theological idea that the them is not as far away as we thought, and that love is love, by reaffirming that idea that human beings share central values. I think those are theological ideas, and I love that it stemmed from an explicit church history book in very explicit part for Evan Wolfson when he was in law school, when he read that book. And so I think that's part of what I would say. And also I would say, I don't know if it's partly because of AIDS and partly because I think our ongoing evolution as a community, recognizing since we're talking about intersections, right when Jim was mentioning, for example, migrants, there's a higher percentage of migrants coming to this country who are LGBTQ because when you add homophobia and transphobia over the economic, in addition to the economic conditions, their situation is worse. When you look at data around LGBTQ people of color, you see that racism and homophobia or transphobia, it's an exponential relationship, not a 1 + 1, but exponentially increasing. So I think our recognition that, like the early AIDS activists saying, we have to have drug trials that include women, that you're only doing white men, you have to include people of color. Like some of these impulses have carried through, I think, to some more intersectional analyses that are only now, I think, beginning to. There were roots and seeds and roots then. Now I think we're beginning to say this is becoming a more part of our analysis in ways that will really help us as a community recognize that the them and us is not. When we address the needs of all those populations, then we will be stronger.
We are close to the end of our time that I want to honor. So, but what maybe last comment here before we wrap it up?
I'm Terry Gardelman, and I teach in the middle school. And one of the things that I've seen come out, and I grew up with Jim, and I was witness to some of his journey and the pain he went through. And my son is gay, and I also witnessed his journey and when he was not accepted in his school from his friends who were Christian. And so being a teacher now in the middle school, I see that our kids have a safe place to come. They're being accepted. Some of them are not having to go through the pain and the journey alone. We have teachers that are accepting of them and helping them to find support and not growing up with that horror that many kids have had to go through. So that's a positive.
That's actually a really great note to end on. Oh, Betsy. Betsy, you're my best friend.
Yeah, I'm going to close it up. This is for Jason. And when I was in the 6th grade, don't ask me how my elementary school brought a Hopi person, a person of the Hopi tribe, to come and talk about the story of the turtle and the beginning of life and how everything is connected and everything is spiritual. And I think you touched upon that in some comments. And today, the creation justice teams of both churches got together to care for the land. And I feel like I got that guidance from this Hopi fellow. And there's so much that I hope that, I'm not looking at Native Americans as being the be-all and the end-all of what to guide us, but there is a lot that can guide us. And I hope that the space will be given to you with your wisdoms and your histories and traditions that this culture really needs. So, and I thank you for your work and being here.
Thank you.
Did you want to say anything? No? I will say just a couple of things to just wrap this up. I'm so grateful to this panel of speakers. Jim, you said something about the importance of making sure that when we tell these stories, we tell the whole story, even the stuff that's painful about our own communities, about our own churches and so on, because the whole story needs to be told in order to do the healing work. And I think what came to mind immediately about that, we're doing a curriculum here at All Saints that is a National Episcopal Church curriculum called Sacred Ground, which is about the history of white supremacy and systemic racism in the United States, and both historical and present. And what we're finding, there are a few people here who are in that group, what we're finding is how important it is for us to confront really painful parts of our history. We need the whole story, and part of that is the really painful history of European settlers with indigenous peoples on this continent. Not just historically, but today. And that there are some really important things for us to learn in contexts like this, where we can be identifying places of overlap and places of synchronicity, as well as some divergences. But important that we do that for the sake of our healing and of moving toward a world of thriving and justice. That was the first thing. The second thing, which is related, this series of events is called the Crossroads of Healing. The image of the cross is complicated. I understand that. In Christian traditions, I understand that well. This is the primary reason why this series is referred to as Crossroads. It evokes intersections, first of all. So there's this way of bringing race, gender, class, sexuality, the environment together in some fruitful ways. There's another aspect of it that's related to art and to beauty. In the history of Christian traditions, there is a strand of those traditions that understands the symbol of the cross as a symbol of beauty. That at first blush is really odd. Why would a symbol of torture and state execution ever be a symbol of beauty? And what theologians in Christian traditions have said is because it represents God's solidarity with human pain, suffering, and death. God's solidarity with us. Therefore, when we as humans engage in acts of solidarity with each other, that too is beautiful. It's beautiful and can be a source of our healing. So I want to make that the last word, as it were, so that you can have some more conversation with these folks, as just informally, but to say, may this be one piece of our ongoing work to be in solidarity with people who are different from us for the sake of the world's healing. That's our work.
There's plenty more food and
Lots
wine.
of food.